I'm Joyce Woodworth. Welcome to the Spirit of Winona and our series on gardens in Winona. We are about to enter Sharon Ropes' exquisite garden. And not only will we see a thing of beauty, but we will learn some gardening advice for our own garden. Sharon's beautiful brick Victorian home sits on Sarnia Street behind a white picket fence. I enter the yard through a trellis that is richly covered with beautiful roses.
Well, hi Joyce, how are you doing?
Great. Your garden looks beautiful.
Oh, thanks. Glad you came over. You want to take a look around?
Oh, I'd love to.
Okay. Well, it's a perfect day.
It is. It's gorgeous.
Maybe we can just walk along here and then I'll sort of explain how the whole thing's laid out.
Sounds good.
Okay. You can see the daylilies are blooming here really nice. July is great for daylilies, and they're a wonderfully hardy annual. They come in a lot of different colors, as you can see here. So I'm really happy with this little collection here.
It is beautiful.
Very colorful.
I see you've added some things here. A little sign.
You know, I really love literary things, so I have little signs and pieces of poetry and things like that all amongst the garden, because the garden really is poetry of another sort. So I tend to combine a lot of literary elements with the garden. So, and they're fun to look at as it goes along.
It is. It's beautiful.
And then you'll recognize the old-fashioned phlox here. They just have a wonderful perfume that comes floating across the yard about this time of year too. And old-fashioned hollyhocks, everyone knows them. But I've tended to choose real old-fashioned flowers when we did landscaping in our house, because you know it's an old-fashioned house from the Victorian era. So once we were done restoring inside, when I moved to the outdoors, I wanted to do something that was harmonious and consistent with the age of the house. So I started doing a lot of researching and reading and trying to find old-fashioned plants that would have been available to the homeowner at the time the house was built. So this is what I've wound up with.
When was your house built, Sharon?
About 1882, as far as we can get the research on it.
So do you think most of these flowers were 1882-ish?
Well, yes, actually, because hollyhocks, by the time Queen Victoria ascended the throne in 1837, she was only 17 or 18, hollyhocks in England were already considered old-fashioned. So they've been around for a long time. So yeah, they were available at the time. So we have a lot of color around here, and at every pillar, it's kind of hid right here. But earlier in the season, the hollyhocks are not in the way, but we have very old-fashioned peonies blooming at each pillar. And these peonies are called Mikado Red, and they were introduced in the 1890s. So they're consistent with the age of the house. And as we go through the garden, I'll point out some of the older varieties, but I'm not a purist, so I do have new fashion things in along with all the old-fashioned stuff.
Sharon, I see right off of your porch you can view this lovely brick garden. Can you tell us about that?
Yes, well, it's laid out in a classically English style with two intersecting brick sidewalks here and a brick edge. And each quadrant, you can see, is planted with a variety of herbs and perennials and annuals, and there's even some vegetables in there. So this is an integrated garden. I have chard and marigolds and petunias, some very antique bachelor buttons. There's oregano, baby's breath, and even dill growing in there.
It's beautiful. Let's go over so you can point out some of these wonderful flowers and herbs.
Well, these calendula here are really the old-fashioned variety, or actually the mother to today's marigolds. And during the 17th century, Dutch grocers would collect the petals off of these, and I'll just pull them off here, and dry them, and then sell them by the barrelful in their grocery stores. And in fact, there's a Dutch saying that says, "No soup or stew is well made without marigold petals."
Oh, so is it flavored? Does it flavor the soup?
It's very mild, but it adds a wonderful golden color to the broth too. So, you know, it's fun to have old plants like that that come with a story.
Yes.
And this is borage, and this is just seeded itself in here. I used to have borage over on the side. It sort of blew in, and gardeners often will let happy accidents like this occur. And look how nice the blue and this the gold is against the marigold. So I just left it there. people use the leaves to chopped up in their salad. They have a cucumber flavor, but the blue flower is just very charming.
It's beautiful. Oh, and I see some beets.
No,
Right?
actually that's Swiss chard. They're still young.
Okay.
That's why you thought, and you saw the red stems. But this Swiss chard series has yellow stems and orange stems and white stems. So later on in the fall, they'll be maybe 2 feet tall and real crunchy, and they do taste like beet greens. So I love them. My kids don't, but later on they'll be very nice.
Sharon, this looks like a blue spruce, but it looks like one I've never seen before.
Well, you're right, it is a blue spruce, but it's been grafted on top of a different kind of root, stock, so that it grows at the top, and there's a different kind of tree that you're looking at as a trunk. And this is a variety of topiary. And I bought it, kind of looks like a big blue lollipop there, but it's a wonderful accent for the middle of the garden, and then all winter long I get to watch it too. So it will stay about this size and not get any bigger just because of the rootstock that it's grafted onto. But it's a fun little piece.
It is. Very fun. You
And
can
we
even
have-
trim it at Christmas time, right?
No,
Oh, you don't?
No, just leave it right there. One of these years we'll string lights out to it and that sort of thing, but right now it's just an ornamental piece.
Okay.
You see some dill in here and dianthus and some salvia, things like that. So this is just a fun little garden to have and get out into. And people might notice, if they're good gardeners at home, that there's weeds here, and that's sort of part of having a garden. You can be a slave to your garden, like your home, have it be immaculate, or you can enjoy it for what it is and tolerate a few weeds blowing in too.
I like that idea. And you know, I also like the fact that you have the dill mixed in with the flowers, the herbs and the vegetables all mixed in with the flowers.
Well, there's a
Makes
lot of
lovely garden.
old-fashioned old sayings and so on that go along with putting herbs next to some flowers. Helps them grow better, actually, and keeps insects away. They're a little repellent. So there's a natural philosophy, and isn't life like this, that nobody's exactly the same? We don't put all the same people together in the same room. It'd be boring. So same thing in the garden.
Good philosophy.
I'll tell you a little bit how I've laid out the garden here, Joyce. This is my spring border right along the picket fence on the west side and part way over here. And I have about 400 antique daffodils planted here of many different varieties, again ones that were available in the 1800s and early 1900s, along with spring blooming shrubs. So this whole area will be alive and vibrant in April and May. And right behind me is a magnolia tree. Now, many people don't know that you can grow several kinds of magnolia in Minnesota. This is a star magnolia, and the white blossoms are about as large as your hand. And they look like big strappy blossoms when they're blooming. But this is a wonderful addition to the garden in May, and then with yellow daffodils and sometimes white daffodils planted all around, it makes a lovely garden. So the shrubs and early perennials are blooming along in this area. So the garden is set up to bloom in April, then we move to May, and then we'll continue on down this way, and I'll tell you about the June garden.
Oh, wonderful. So it goes in a sequence,
Right.
a seasonal sequence.
Yeah, and I call it planting in seasonal vignettes, because what I've found myself, and also working with people and doing garden design, is that they might have a lot of flowers and yet they're unsatisfied with the effect that it's producing. They'll have a flower here and then one around the back side of the house and something's blooming over there, and they don't know what's the problem. And we find that by planting seasonal bloomers together, there gives a sense of abundance, like around the house. This is all a July blooming area, and it looks bright and colorful and abundant. The same thing is true in your garden. If you plant June bloomers together, then you have a fabulous place to line up the kids for pictures, or put your lawn chairs, or enjoy that area. And once it's finished blooming, it goes green and quiet, but then another part of the garden comes alive. So that's how I've chosen to lay out my garden. This is the June garden right here between this yew tree and the second yew tree, and it's just finishing up. You'll see there's some late lilies blooming here. Queen Anne's lace blew in, and I just let it blossom now because I do enjoy the lacy flower. And when it's done, I'll just pull it out and give the hike. Now, you know the story about Queen Anne's lace?
Well, I know it's a member of the carrot family.
Right, exactly. This is a precursor to the modern day carrot. In fact, if you pull it up, the roots smell a lot like carrots, you can tell. And people used to eat them, but they were bitter and horrible, but they didn't have the modern day carrot yet. But it's called Queen Anne's lace commonly because during Queen Anne's reign in England, she was known for her beautiful lace handiwork. And right in the center, you can see there's a little tiny purple spot. And the legend goes that one day, as she was doing her needlework, she pricked her finger, and a little drop of blood fell on her handiwork. And the Queen Anne's lace flower sprung up in homage to that event. So that's why it's commonly called Queen Anne's lace.
It's a beautiful story.
But we have very cultivated flowers. This is a very new coral bell called Purple Palace, a brand new introduction, but yet I have it planted next to roadside daisies and the old shrub roses with their wonderful fragrance. Everything I have in my garden has to survive on its own. I love it, and I'll work with it a little bit, but I don't want to be powdering and spraying and coddling, covering it up for winter and uncovering it in the spring. So if it's in my garden, it's got to be pretty tough and beautiful. We're just coming to the July garden now, and you can see the yarrow is blooming and the blue balloon flowers. They're called balloon flowers because they look like little balloons before they open them. In fact, if they're just ready, you can squeeze them and they'll pop like a balloon. They're nice to have. The Joe Pye weed with the dusky purple rising into the air there is just starting to show a little bit of color. Some of these things will be coming into bloom a little bit later. I love purple coneflower. This is a native flower to the prairie lands of Minnesota. And it's got this real prickly cone in the top that will continue to elongate into a real orangey, coppery, prickly cone. And the indigenous tribes for prairie land and woodland Indians would dry this cone and use it as a comb for their hair. So some of the plants come to us with a really intriguing history.
I have those in my garden, and they are taking over my whole garden.
They do seed themselves all around if they're happy. My garden here used to have a great big stand, and they're eventually dying out because it's too moist. Now you must have a drier climate for them because that's really what they prefer. So I'm going to have to find a better area for my purple coneflower because they're too great to be without.
Are you saying my coneflowers are happier
They
than
are
your
very
coneflowers?
happy. Your coneflowers are happy. And this is another grass that I just love. Some of these daisies have just finished up here. But this is called blue oatgrass. And it looks like a giant blue fescue, if you know what blue fescue grass is. But this adds wonderful texture to the garden, and look how blue it is. It's just silvery blue. I just love it. And one of the things you try to do when you're planting a garden is vary the leaf size and texture and color, so everything's not medium green, medium green, medium green. So this is a great plant for accents. It looks really nice against the purple leaves and some of the regular green.
It's the color of sage, isn't it?
Oh, it's gorgeous. Just gorgeous. And this garden here is just hasn't come into being yet. It's still a little quiet, although we do have some things planted for bloom. Some of the trumpet lilies are blooming now, but this will look really wonderful in August. And then we move into the fall garden here. This is on the east side, and this is full of starflowers and hibiscus, chrysanthemums, and lots of different kinds of asters and sedums. So about the time the kids go back to school in the fall, it just looks wonderful with pinks and blues and dusky purples again and some whites and lavenders. So it looks really nice for fall. By that time, the rest of the garden is pretty quiet and green and just verdant, but then you always have a place to take pictures of kids. And so that's one of the things I like best about these seasonal vignettes. There's always something going on that's interesting.
Now, I'm sure you don't have a winter garden.
I do.
Oh, you do?
I do.
Well, let's see it. Sharon tells me we are standing currently in the winter garden.
Right.
Describe it to me, please.
The winter garden sounds curious to a lot of people because obviously there's nothing that blooms in the winter in Minnesota. What I mean by a winter garden is a garden that's full of color and texture and shape and form and density that'll look beautiful against a snowy landscape. So, for example, this Douglas fir has such soft needles on it. It's just wonderful, and look how blue it is. Now, this stands out magnificently against the snow and the gray fence, and behind it you have other kinds of evergreens that are dark green, yellow green. During the winter time they go blackened green, so you have many different colors amongst the evergreens to look at. And then you have this wonderful weeping shape of this weeping mulberry tree. So this is a nice addition. It's an ornamental, fun tree during the summertime to look at, but during the winter it continues to add value to the landscape with this graceful draping effect. And then behind here you can see all these shrubs. They're rather nondescript right now, and that's okay. But this winter they'll be showing their burgundy stems because they're red-twig dogwoods. So you'll have all those red twigs, the different colors of blues and greens, the weeping forms. We have trellises put up on the fence that will have those vines scrambling around and give sort of interesting looks there. And the white shape of the summer house. So it makes a really fun winter garden to be looking out the kitchen window at.
Oh, you make me want to come back in the winter just to see it.
Well, you'll have to do that.
I will, but let's look at this trunk of this tree. This is so interesting.
Isn't it gorgeous?
I've never seen a trunk that color before.
It's a really pale gray, isn't it? And it's smooth. It's not typical of the evergreen bark, which is usually flaky and more of a nondescript brown or gray.
This is a very unusual tree for Winona, isn't it?
It's not very common. You can find them around. They're a little bit pricey, but they are a spectacular tree, and it will get to grow pretty big someday. But boy, I think it's just stunning.
Sharon, is this part of your seasonal garden as well?
Well, it's a little bit different, and then this is planted in the true cottage garden style. I plant cottage garden style, which is just a mingling of perennials and annuals and herbs and everything all together. This particular area has no formal design to it at all. Wherever the red ragged monarda wants to spread, it spreads, and I have very little control. You see the butterfly on the purple coneflower there. That's a very high nectar plant, and it's enjoying a little bit of that nectar right there. Purple coneflower does better back here than out in the more moist front garden. And the hollyhocks seed themselves wherever they fall and grow. They just grow. I do very little intervention here, and that's in a true cottage garden style, as opposed to the rest of the garden where there's regular intervals of yew trees, and there's some shrubs that are trimmed and clipped and weeding sort of thing going on. This is just rather a wild garden.
Oh, and I like the excuse of a cottage garden.
Yes, hey, you know, the other thing that gardeners do is if we let weeds get out of hand, we just get one of those silver metal markers and we write down the botanical name of the weed and stick it in. It's a real great way to justify weeds being in your garden.
And I see you also have some unplanted plants in your garden.
Yes, and it's nearly the end of July, but I say every good gardener, if they're a serious gardener, has a few things that they never got planted. So we always have a couple little pots or flats of things sitting around that you wind up watering in their own containers.
You even have some interesting stepping stones over here to the
Yes,
cottage garden.
These are fun. These are just cement stepping stones that we made in the bottom of an ice cream bucket, or this one was made in the bottom of a flower pot. Homemade cement, and we did it on family vacation one year when we had my whole extended family there, cousins and mom and dad and all my brothers and sisters and their children, and everyone made their handprint and then put their name in, and I use them for stepping stones in my garden. So this happens to be my sister Diane's garden, and I can walk through there stepping on the stepping stones so I don't injure the flowers. And each of the gardens out front there have my mom and dad are out there, and my brother Dave and his little 2-year-old Jennifer are out in my garden. So it's just a nice way to remember that family connection.
Oh yes, nice way to think of each person individually.
Right, and they're all here and they're with me.
Let's go on and see what's over in this interesting corner.
Okay. Well, I have piles of books here, Joyce. I think every gardener winds up collecting a few garden books along the way too. And there's so many garden books out there, but that's been a really good way for me to increase my personal knowledge about gardening. And once you start collecting that, then you get into these. They're vintage garden books. Now, sometimes the techniques are a little bit outdated, but the language is so flowery, and people spoke in a beautiful way around the turn of the century. And even the early part of the century, 20s and 30s, it's fun to go through some of those and read how they used to write. So I have a whole vintage garden book collection too, along with all my modern stuff.
You must have words we've never heard of too, like a pestiferous reed. Have you heard of that?
Well, I think they use a lot of real botanical terms that people tend not to use so much anymore.
You might need a dictionary with this book.
It looks like it.
This garden gives me a feeling of being in Arizona.
This is my husband's collection of all sorts of different cactus. He's had this collection, I think, for about 15 years or so, and they usually spend most of their life in the basement underneath lights, and he goes down and waters them occasionally. But during the summer, and I think a lot of people with houseplants move the houseplants outdoors so they get that fresh air and sort of renewed with the rain and all that sort of thing. So he hauls them in and out, and looks like a few of them are just getting ready to bloom there, so that they must be doing okay there.
Well, I like the way the Arizona garden leads into this lovely, inviting spot over here.
Yeah, it's a nice, peaceful, shady area, and most gardeners do have some shade spots, so I have an opportunity to put in some of these wonderful big hostas and nice, cool shade lovers, and it's nice to come out here and read a book in the afternoon and get out of the hot sun. It's peaceful, and all those red twig dogwoods block the screen, you know, or give us some privacy from the front yard.
Well, Sharon, what is this interesting structure all about?
Well, believe it or not, we have miniature chickens in here. A couple of years ago, I was feeling particularly lonesome for the farm. You know, when I grew up, we'd always go back to my mom's farm and my cousin's farm for the summer. My city kids don't have any farming experience anymore, so I got this great idea. They were in elementary school that we might raise some miniature chickens for a summer project. So every year for the last 6 years, at Easter, we get little day-old chickens, little hatchlings. Did you know they deliver them? The post office delivers them in the mail.
Really?
And did you know there's such a thing as chicken catalogs?
Yes,
You've
I do.
heard-
I lived on a farm.
Hey.
My dog used to eat the baby chicks.
Oh no! Well, I had no idea about chickens, and it turns out there's as many different varieties of chickens as there are dogs. So we get a collection of 5 different breeds every year and raise them in the basement until they get their feathers on them, and then bring them out here to the summer house. And I wanted something architecturally that looked beautiful, again from the house in the winter garden, and that was consistent with our home. And so I copied the dental work on here that matched the house, and these little clover leaves are the same clover leaves that are around the porch, and this is the same pattern as the lattice work underneath the porch. So I had a carpenter build this, and
Great
so every
idea.
summer now we have chickens. And here, chick, 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 chick. I just threw in some of their favorite weeds, and the wonderful thing about chickens is they don't roam free, of course, in the city, but if they would get into the garden, they'd pick out all the weeds and things like that for me. And so I have several different varieties here now, and about the time we have the county fair, which was last week, we just got rid of all the boys. So we only have the girls left. The boys are starting to test their voices. Right around fair times, we bring them down and give them away to farming friends. But there's buff-colored chickens in here with white ones, and some with black tails, and some that are red, white, and speckled, and they're just beautiful. And it brings sort of a pastoral quality and that sort of thing to a city backyard.
It feels like you're right in the country here.
Yeah, they're fun. Well, I see you found one of my books, Joyce.
Oh, yes, it's so interesting.
Well, here's your lemonade,
Oh,
fresh,
thank
with
you.
some fresh spearmint from the garden, too.
Wonderful.
It's great on a hot day.
Oh, it's delicious.
Thanks.
Well, I hear a lovely waterfall behind me.
Well, you know, actually, people call it a water garden, and I correct them and say it's not a water garden, it's our puddle. Because it's only about 2 feet by 2 feet across. It's just a very small little circle. But it is nice to have the flow of water, and we do have about 7 little goldfish in there and a few water plants. But water gardens are very labor intensive, so I didn't want to get into a big water garden project. So we have our puddle.
Sharon, I don't think I've ever been in such an organized garden before.
Oh.
It's just been beautiful, and I
Well,
want to thank you so much for having us here and sharing your garden with us and all your wonderful ideas for gardening tips.
Well, great. I'm glad to have you. Stop by anytime.
Thank you. This has been Joyce Woodworth for the Spirit of Winona. Please join us again on our next garden series.